The level of literature of today's content is very similar to claim by the Orc Queen, perhaps mounted by the Minotaur, analyzed by the Alien, Bigfoot Pirates, Haunt My Balls, How to Discipline Your Vampire, and Scorched by the Hellhound. So not exactly deep, thoughtful content, however, it's always engaging to go through these things because we have gotten the first relevant Mythic raid testing in the Midnight beta. So as usual, the returning hard-working Robbie Dobby has made a collection of Warcraft logs results of all of the specs that I've tested in the beta in the past week. So we have the results of the specs testing their new version in Midnight, and we can get to see the results. Obviously, damage right now isn't that relevant, which is why this is mostly for fun. This is mostly to start to give the opportunity to many players to start dooming about the fate of their specs in Midnight, or perhaps to get overly confident about 2.5 months pre-release numbers, only to find themselves into the F tier by the time the expansion releases. So for today, we're looking at the results of the DPS in the raid, and we can start immediately with a discount. We can immediately start removing a couple of specs that essentially have been on strike, not played nearly enough to even have any kind of thought behind them, which is Arcane and Marksmanship. These two specs were the least played, or even barely enough to find them in these results, so we are excluding from the talk these two specs, presumably expecting maybe some changes by Blizzard, given that not even the players themselves want to test these specs. However, above them we still have a pretty relevant and visible D tier, bottom tier, least played specs, but not even that, even just worst performing specs in these tests for Mythic raiding, which were Assassination, Outlaw, Affliction, Feral, and Survival. Now, the first of these worth talking about for a second is Affliction, simply because Affliction was one of the better ones a few weeks ago. We even had a video dedicated to Affliction, and how not even that bad, or rather pretty nice it was after the even after the pruning in Midnight. Well, the problem is that what happened to Affliction ever since we went over the results is that they have been nerfed. Numerically speaking, they haven't actually changed what they were doing. The damage of Unstable Affliction has been nerfed by 75%, and then on top of being nerfed by 75%, was nerfed again just a few days ago by 25% again. So now their numbers are much lower than they used to be, and they found themselves towards the worst of the performance in the raid, next to Assassination, Outlaw, Feral, and Survival. Not that their position has changed from what they have been pretty much most of the beta. The more unique one in this category has been Affliction, which looked better before, but now it doesn't. A tier above them you have Subtlety, you have both Fury and Arms, as well as Enhancement and Ret Paladin. Now, here as well, Fury and Arms have been recently buffed. They have been receiving a decent amount of attention from Blizzard, especially when it comes to their Apex talents. We have actually covered both of these two warrior specs when it came to their DPS already, and I think they're both good, they're both nice, they play nicely now, with still a few problems, but I wouldn't be too worried about their state just because right now they aren't doing that well. It is still one of those more optimistic cases where the situation right now is just a numbers tuning kind of thing. It's not that the specs, both Arms and Fury right now, are broken. They have been functionally gutted from the war within. In fact, we pointed out, as you can see yourself here, that they have lost nothing. They are one of the too few DPS specs who basically did not lose a single button from the war within to Midnight in terms of pruning. They actually haven't lost anything, so not that bad for these two specs. Funnily enough, not even for Enhancement, since Enhancement has already been praised for being quite the improved and good spec in Midnight, with very nice QOL changes, so I don't think even enhancement players would be too worried right now about finding themselves in the bottom third of the results of raid testing, given that their spec right now looks quite nice. We will see much more simplistic and or bad specs doing much more damage right now. I wouldn't be too happy being them compared to being an enhancement shaman right now in terms of how the spec actually plays. Now, in the middle, the average, the nothing really too bad or too nice to say about the specs, we have Windwalker, Unholy, Devourer, Demon Hunter, and Destro Warlock. Now, Devourer, we're not spending too much time to talk about it because anyone who's not in the beta or even that doesn't bother about Devourer, you have no idea what basically any of this is. So I just find it funny that at least for now, the spec even being tested in the beta is not OP. You would think Blizzard releases a new spec or even releases it in the beta and gives it more attention, gives it more polish, gives it more special features. No, Devourer doesn't have much of any special features right now in the beta. It is completely middling, both in Mythic Plus and in the raid testing, even though it is the most popular, of course, because it's the new one, but it doesn't really have anything particularly good right now going for them. Destro and Unholy are also here. Perhaps they might be fitting log here. They might be suffering a bit more by being in the same class as Frost Decay and Demonology Warlock, which likely would draw away players from both Destro and Unholy, but they are doing fine in terms of damage. We have gone over Destro as well. It's not that while doing fine in damage, their specs are that exciting. We just mentioned enhancement, for example, being below Destro. It's just tiny numbers tuning. Definitely not in terms of how nice it is to play the spec. Destro has been even more, yes, it was possible, even more simplified than it was in the War Within, but the damage right now is middling. Now, as for the good performers, the top end of the results, as we have seen from these logs throughout all of the testable bosses in Mythic, across all of the different bosses. Some of them were pure single target, some had some AoE, others had tons of AoE, so the numbers of course are gonna skew based on the damage profile. In the A tier, performing quite nicely, we had Fire Mage, Elemental Shaman, Havoc Demon Hunter, and both of the Evokers, Augmentation and Devastation Evoker. Now, Devastation, even though here, for example, looks like to be doing very nice, this was Chimerus, which, as you can see from the damage breakdown, it's an enormous amount of AoE. That's what put both of these guys playing. Funnily enough, this is a good example because they are playing two completely different hero talents. You have both Flame Shaper and Scale Commander getting the same results, which is doing tons of burst damage during the add phase. So you get to see what brought Devastation Evokers at this level in the logs of this fight. But then outside of this mega AoE window, they still are in the sort of top third, even top fourth, if that's a word, of the results, but not as well, not as nice as their AoE result, which is also what coincidentally is putting them as one of the most played specs in the higher beta Mythic Plus keys right now in Mythic Plus, because of this AoE damage from Devastation. But of course in the raid is not as relevant. Now Fire, we have to have an asterisk for, a relevant point to talk about because they were in the same dooming category as Arcane. And as you can see here, fitting results, there is no Arcane. Arcane was just completely on strike. Now, Fire has received some changes in the last set of tuning, which has now, I guess, pushed more mages to go back to playing Fire. Now, not that these changes were that relevant in terms of your final damage results. As you can see, Scorch is still completely pointless, but it fits the rotation better. Scorch has been brought back after it was deleted from the game in the early stages of Midnight. Just this last reset, Scorch was put back into your talents with all of the previous functionalities of Scorch. So now you have more mages going back to play Fire. Now, it's not changing that much still. You can see here your classic experience of a 20+ second long combustion into hyperthermia window where you're just clicking pyro. Even in this padding AoE fight like Camarus, pyro is still now by a large amount your largest sources of damage clicks. This Veloren is single target, so there is no padding here, right? The other version of fire right now, which is Frostfire, plays obviously differently, way more value on your fireball, now renamed Frostfire Bolt. But there has been, let's just say, fire has been now given more of a highlight in being played after the tuning, which gave them back things that they had lost. Something that didn't happen to Arcane, hence the strike on not playing Arcane is continuing. We also have to put an asterisk on another spec here, because there is always a danger when we mention this spec doing nice, which is the one we mentioned being augmentation. So, as you know, perhaps you didn't know, now you know, augmentation has been changed, will be changed in Midnight to essentially become global, become raid-wide in their buffs, in their effects. Besides, of course, Prescience, but Ebon Might, the one that matters, right? Now it's going to buff all of your allies, so there is not a lot of min-maxing and spreadsheets required anymore to be able to play Augmentation Evoker. Also, a lot of your damage, of course, as a result, will be way more self-produced. It's not anymore when you go to the damage done and you will see augmentation right over here, and then the buffed damage will be all the way over here. Now you are much less of a buff bot and much more of a traditional sort of DPS spec. Still though, as you can see, Ebon Might is still your main source of damage, which is a buff, but not nearly as big as before, and more importantly, as complicated. That is perhaps the more relevant part when it comes to augmentation, is not as complicated. So it's always a danger, right? We don't really want to see this. So it's always a danger, it's always a threat to have the possibility of augmentation becoming a meta thing in an expansion. Right now their numbers are good, so there is a possibility for disaster in the next expansion. Now, as for the S tier, well, we have an image right here which is explaining already some of these. Fittingly, the S tier is comprised of Frost Mage, Demo Warlock, as well as BM Hunter, Shadow Priest, Frost DK, and Balance Druid. Now, this is actually pretty nice because we are missing the Balance Druid here, but we have the Frost Mage, you have the Frost DK, you also have the BM Hunter, and you also have the Demo Warlock. So we have almost all of the gang right here in a single log. Well, Demo has a, how to put it, pretty strong Apex talent point system right now, which is this one, and also this one. Either way, you got even more power put into your Demonic Tyrant, because when you summon your Tyrant, every 2 Hand of Gul'dans, you can summon more demons, and these demons, turns out, do a lot of damage. That's all it is, and right now, Demo is doing a lot of damage, more so in single target than they do in AoE. This power is still a lot centered on single target damage, but it's a lot. Now, the spec itself, this is perhaps one of the biggest divides between feeling good because your damage is high right now, versus feeling bad because the spec is shit. That's kind of the situation Demo is in right now. I don't want to tune into my Master of Demons, my army of fell demonic monsters behind me, and then I see that the buttons I'm pressing are Hand of Gul'dan, Demon Bolt, and Shadow Bolt. I'm a Shadow caster now. Where are my demons? When am I summoning my demons now? I'm barely even touching my demon buttons now because I'm spamming spells. That's the state right now that demonology is in. So if I were an old-timer boomer fan of Demo, I wouldn't give a shit about the high damage they have right now, and I would rather be sad about the state of the spec in how it plays, you know, the flavor of the spec right now. Not really that much demon themed, at the moment. Yes, technically the Apex talent is a demon, but doesn't feel that nice to play. Now, as for the others we have, which you can just scroll by different types of logs, you will likely, generally speaking, see many of these still make it towards the top, depending on the fight. If it's heavy AoE or heavy single target, of course they will swing in difference, but some of these have been a constant. One of them, Balance Druid, has been doing fine in both, not at the level of the others, but still fine. BM, we have looked at BM already. We'll look at how it works. It's still as straightforward and simple as it was back in the War Within. Not much has changed from the older days of BM, so there isn't much we can go over to talk about, because what is here to talk about? It's 3 buttons. Just press those 3 buttons. Now it's even simpler to press barb shot, so press them even with less IQ required. So not too much to mention about BM. We could spend time talking about Frostmage, because they have been receiving a whole bunch of different changes as we went over when we went over the balance tuning. The much heavier focus now on shattering stacks on enemies, the effectiveness it had in Mythic Plus, the ease now you have to shatter for extra damage, of course, in AoE multiple mobs without you having to tab target, find the targets with the shatter stacks to break them, etc, etc. Now it's much easier and simpler to do so in AoE, but even in single target at the moment their damage is very good. And I'm not even that off about this set of rotation, because it is still varied enough. You have enough procs and cycles of Ray of Frost, Frozen Orb, Glacial Spike, and then the procs, I guess, of Flurry to use, which still feels diverse enough, and at the moment the damage is also nice. So it is somewhat understanding why so many mages are pissed at the state of Arcane and refuse to play it, to go over, for example, and default to play Frost at the moment, which is doing just fine, not just in terms of damage, but also in the way the spec is playing. The last one here at the top was Frost DK. Frost DK has not particularly changed from live. You have, I guess, still this one. In this case, it's a very AoE heavy fight, so you will see Frost side with Glacial Advance as your main spenders. Otherwise, it would have been Obliterate and Frost Strike, but it doesn't really change. You can even see from the outlook of the spec, most of these would look the same if you were in AoE or in single target back in the War Within, with single target and AoE spenders and then Howling Blast. It is similar to what we said about Fury Warrior and Arms Warrior. You haven't lost too much of what you used to have. Even your multi cooldown setup, the fact that you have Reaper's, if you're playing Deathbringer, you have Reaper's Mark, but then you also have Pillar of Frost, you still have Empowered Rune Weapon, and then of course you have Breath of Sindragosa and Frost and Fury. So you have still that collection of cooldowns, for example, still there, buttons still there. So if Frost was good to you in the War Within, zero problems transitioning in the supposed pruning of Midnight, which Frost DK didn't really get nowhere near as hard and as badly as other specs did. And at the moment, as a bonus, they also just happen to have top damage, one of the top damages in the meta. Last one worth touching on is Shadow Priest, which to do so we will use a fitting fight for them, Saladar, the testing in Mythic for Shadow Priest. They have been doing very nicely, despite the nerf, which checked with the balance tuning. They had their shadowy apparitions, for example, nerfed significantly, both the proc rate, the insanity generation, the damage of your Shadow Word Madness. Many nerfs, but right now their damage is still very nice, especially in AoE. Again, one of the specs that is more played in Mythic Plus in higher level keys. This fight, Saladar has ad spawns which work very well for Shadow Priest, and the results have been nice. The spec is simpler compared to the War Within, but not by too much. You have lost some of the cool things like stacking multiple empowerments of your Mind Flay Insanity and then use them at the right moment. Not that that's gone. It's not as nice as it was in the War Within, but you haven't been damaged too much, too greatly, like other specs. So at the moment they are having it quite nicely in these results in the beta, Shadow Priest. Now, these are the results that were seen in the testing in the beta. As we mentioned, there are a few specs that were very lowly played, quite ignored overall in the testing, whereas others were very popular. That tends to happen. Even if it's the beta, players will still congregate towards the specs that do the most damage, even if it's just for testing. It's not real. Players will still do it. So definitely many of these specs would be able to have a better performance if just more players actually bother to play those specs. Except that now there weren't really many in some of these specs being played. It was more a congregation of the better performing specs, but this is what we have right now after the first semi-serious mythic testing round in the beta of Midnight. Perhaps there are also other things worth considering, like the fact that this is the round of beta testing before an expansion release we will have to go to without add-ons, and with the whole supposed change of Blizzard of also changing the way they want to develop raid encounters because they take into account the loss of add-ons. So far there hasn't really been much of that, but this was an early testing. We won't have that many before the end of the year, where Blizzard goes on a 2-week vacation. So we don't have that much time left before entering January, in which case then you enter a few weeks before the release of the pre-patch. So this was the first of the testing results we have seen in the beta of Midnight. So with this, of course, leaving room for overreactions, dooming and coping, or perhaps seeding at other specs, or even celebrating at the state of your own spec if you're that gullible to believe your spec will stay as good as it is now into the rest of the expansion. Today, on this Wednesday, we can leave each other. We're starting the goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who's been supporting completely for free, by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I think we get 2 more rounds of tuning before Christmas break, and that's gonna be it.